Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The scream was the first thing to die, a sharp, useless sound torn from her throat and devoured by the vast, indifferent Texas wind. Elara Vance stood rooted to the warped planks of the porch, a statue carved from 19 years of grief, watching the wagon that held her entire past shrink into a dusty, hateful speck on the horizon. It wasn't just the wagon that was leaving. It was the very concept of mother, of father, of a place to call home. She could still feel the phantom sting of Jedediah's last glare and the chilling emptiness in Martha's eyes, a void where a mother's love was supposed to be. The red dust, kicked up by the wobbling wheels, coated her tongue with the taste of rust and finality. Beside her, her brothers, Thomas and Samuel, trembled, their small hands clutching the frayed edges of her skirt as if she were the last solid thing on earth. Against her chest, baby Willow slept in a sling, her innocent breaths a stark contrast to the world that had just collapsed around them. Elara did not grant them the luxury of her tears. Crying was a language her parents had beaten out of her long ago. As the last rumble of the wagon faded into the oppressive silence of the plains, she felt the name, Vance, slough off her skin like a snake shedding a dead, constricting hide. A vow, cold and hard as iron, formed in her soul, spoken in a whisper that was louder than any scream she had ever uttered. That name dies with you. The sun bled across the sky, painting the clouds in brutal shades of orange and purple, a celestial bruise that mirrored her own. This was not an ending. It was a baptism by abandonment, a brutal, bloody birth into a life she would have to build from the splinters of the old one. Part 1. A name left in the dust. Sevens. The silence that followed the wagon's departure was a physical entity, a heavy blanket that smothered all other sound, leaving only the rasp of the wind and the frantic beating of Elara's own heart. That first night in the skeletal remains of the farmhouse was a descent into a primal fear she had never known. The cold was a living predator, seeping through the cracked walls and floorboards, its icy teeth sinking deep into their bones. She built a fire from the splintered remains of a kitchen chair, a pathetic, sputtering flame that cast long, dancing shadows that looked like grasping claws. Her brothers, Thomas and Samuel, huddled against her, their small bodies racked with shivers that had nothing to do with the temperature. They did not cry for their mother. They had learned long ago that some names were not worth calling. They whimpered from a deeper, more immediate terror, the gnawing emptiness in their bellies. Elara held them tight, her own hunger a dull, familiar ache she could ignore, but theirs was a fresh wound, and she felt every pang as if it were her own. She wrapped them, along with a fitfully sleeping Willow, in the single threadbare blanket they owned, its fabric as thin as a prayer. She remained awake all night, a silent sentinel, watching the embers die one by one, feeling the crushing weight of 3 small lives settling squarely upon her 19-year-old shoulders. The vow she had made on the porch, to let the name Vance die, had felt like an act of defiance then. In the suffocating darkness, it felt like a prophecy of their own demise. Morning arrived not with warmth, but with a pale, unforgiving light that exposed the brutal reality of their situation. The frost had painted the world in a cruel, glittering beauty, turning every dead weed into a sliver of glass. But beauty could not be eaten. Leaving the children huddled by the cold ashes with strict instructions not to make a sound, Elara set out into the hostile landscape. The land around them was a study in scarcity. Thorny creosote bushes clung to the cracked, red earth, and the skeletal fingers of mesquite trees reached toward a sky the color of faded denim. The wind was relentless, a constant thief that stole the warmth from her skin and whistled a mournful song through the canyons. With her bare hands, she dug into the frozen soil near a dried-up creek bed, her fingernails breaking, her knuckles scraping raw against the sharp stones. After an hour of torturous labor, her reward was a handful of bitter roots and a few wild onions, their scent sharp and desperate in the clean, cold air. It was barely enough for one person, let alone four. As she trudged back, the meager harvest clutched in her apron, a profound sense of hopelessness threatened to buckle her knees. How many days could they survive like this? How long until their strength gave out, leaving them as bleached and forgotten as the animal bones scattered across the plains? It was in that moment of despair that she saw him. At first, he was just a dark shape on the distant ridge, a stark silhouette against the vast, empty sky. Her blood ran cold. In this lawless land, a lone rider often meant danger. Her immediate instinct was to run, to hide the children, but there was nowhere to go. Their ruined house was a trap, not a fortress. So she stood her ground, pushing her brothers behind her skirt, her body becoming a frail, defiant shield. The rider did not approach with the hurried hunger of an outlaw. His pace was measured, deliberate, the gait of a man who was the master of his own time and territory. As he drew closer, details emerged from the silhouette. He rode a powerful black horse, its coat sleek even under a layer of dust. A well-oiled rifle rested in a saddle scabbard, and a coiled lariat hung from his pommel. This was no drifter. This was a man of substance, a man who belonged to this land in a way she never could. He wore a low-brimmed hat that shadowed his face, but she knew who he was before he even got close enough to speak. Silas Blackwood. His name was a whisper in the town of Dust River, a story told in hushed tones about a man who owned the largest ranch in the county but lived like a ghost upon it, a man scarred by a tragedy that had stolen his family and his voice. He reined his horse to a halt a respectful distance away, his posture relaxed, but radiating a coiled stillness. His gaze, the color of a stormy sky, swept over the scene before him, missing nothing. He saw the broken porch, the hollow windows, the pathetic pile of roots in her apron, the fear in her brother's wide eyes, and the defiant terror in her own. His stare was not one of pity. It was more unnerving, like that of a hawk assessing its prey, or a carpenter measuring a piece of wood before the cut. It was a look of pure, unadulterated observation. "That was Jedediah Vance's place," he said. His voice was a low rumble, like stones grinding together deep underground. It was not a question. Elara lifted her chin, the words catching in her dry throat. "He's gone. Took what he could, I imagine," Silas stated, his eyes flicking to the gutted interior of the house, visible through the broken door. "Left the rest behind." His gaze fell upon her and the children, and the meaning was brutally clear. They were the rest. The debts. The refuse. Elara bristled, a fire igniting in her chest. "We don't need anything from you," she spat, the words sharper than she intended. A muscle twitched in his jaw, the only sign that he had registered her hostility. He looked at the sky, a vast and empty canvas. "Storms coming from the north. That roof won't hold." It was a simple statement of fact, yet it felt like a judgment, a final nail in the coffin of her hopes. She offered no reply. simply staring back at him, her silence a wall of jagged pride. She expected him to press, to offer pity, to ask the questions that would force her to speak her shame aloud. But he did none of those things. For another long, stretched-out moment, he simply sat there, a silent observer to her ruin. Then, with a curt, almost imperceptible nod, as if he had confirmed some private thought, he turned his horse. Without another word, without a backward glance, he rode away, his form shrinking back into the landscape as quietly and mysteriously as it had appeared. Elara watched until he was gone, her body trembling with a mixture of relief and a strange, unsettling anger. He had seen their desperation, their utter vulnerability, and he had done nothing. He had simply looked and left. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, the wind shifted, carrying the sharp, cold bite he had predicted. The sky to the north was turning a bruised, angry purple. That night, as the first flakes of snow began to whisper against the broken window panes, Elara found it. Tucked into the sheltered corner of the porch, a place she was certain had been empty an hour before, was a heavy burlap sack. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Was it a trap? A cruel joke? With trembling hands, she loosened the twine at its top. The scent that wafted out was the smell of salvation. Inside lay a side of bacon, a bag of flour, a tin of coffee, another of beans, and nestled at the very bottom, a thick, woolen blanket. It was heavy and clean, and it smelled faintly, unmistakably, of cedar, leather, and the cold, clean air of the open range. There was no note, there was no name, but she knew, and the knowledge was not a comfort. It was a terrifying mystery. Part 2. The Recluse's Bargain. Sevens. The anonymous gifts continued for 3 days, a silent, almost ghostly providence that both sustained and shamed them. A small sack of potatoes appeared one morning, their earthy scent a promise of substance. The next day, a string of freshly caught fish lay wrapped in wet leaves on the porch step, their silver scales shimmering in the dawn light. Finally, a block of salt, more precious than gold in this parched land, sat waiting as if it had materialized from the very air. Elara accepted them with a pragmatic heart, her fierce pride warring with the undeniable, desperate hunger of her siblings. She was a survivor, not a fool, and she would not let her brothers and sisters starve for the sake of her own vanity. She cooked the food over their small, smoky fire, rationing every bite, ensuring the children ate until their bellies were round and their eyelids grew heavy. But with every mouthful she swallowed, the charity felt like a brand on her soul, a mark of her own helplessness that chafed and burned. This silent benefactor, this shadow on the ridge, had given them life, but in doing so, had taken a piece of her fierce independence. She knew this fragile arrangement, this reliance on a ghost's kindness, could not last. A man's charity, like a winter storm, was unpredictable and could vanish as quickly as it appeared. She needed to stand on her own feet, to earn their survival, not receive it as an offering. The town of Dust River was a single, dusty street carved out of the vast indifference of the plains, a scar of civilization on an otherwise untamed landscape. It consisted of a handful of sun-bleached wooden buildings huddled together as if for warmth. A general store, a saloon whose swinging doors sighed with every gust of wind, a blacksmith's forge that coughed black smoke into the pristine air, and a small, white-steepled church that seemed to be perpetually praying for rain. When Ilara walked down that street, her brother's hands clutching hers, Willow asleep in her sling, the town fell silent. Men leaning on porch posts stopped their whittling, their eyes, sharp and assessing, following her every move. Women sweeping their stoops paused, their gazes taking in her worn dress, the fierce, protective set of her jaw, and the 3 quiet children trailing her like a chain of misfortune. She entered the general store, the jingle of the bell above the door announcing her presence like a judgment. The air inside was thick with the smells of coffee, leather, and dried apples. The proprietor, a balding man named Henderson with a perpetually worried expression, looked her over, his gaze lingering on the 3 extra mouths to feed. "Looking for work," Ilara stated, her voice clear and steady, betraying none of the desperation clawing at her throat. "Any work? Mending clothes, scrubbing floors, anything." Henderson sighed, polishing the already clean wooden countertop with a rag. "Work's scarce, miss," he said, not unkindly, but with an air of weary finality. "And mouths to feed ain't." It was the same story everywhere she went. The saloon owner laughed, the blacksmith shook his head, the livery stable owner simply pointed to the empty stalls as evidence of hard times. She was an unknown quantity, a nameless woman who had appeared out of nowhere, a burden waiting to happen in a town where everyone already carried their own. The coldest reception came not in words, but in a single, searing look. As she passed the church, a stern-faced woman in a severe black bonnet emerged, holding the hand of a small boy. This was Mrs. Gable, the preacher's wife, a woman whose piety was the town's moral compass. Her eyes met Ilara's, and in that brief, cold glance, Ilara was weighed, measured, and found wanting. Mrs. Gable said nothing, but she pulled her own son a little closer, a gesture more eloquent than any sermon, as if poverty and misfortune were a contagion one could catch from a single look. Defeated, her boots heavy with dust and the crushing weight of public shame, Ilara knew she had only one card left to play. The ghost on the ridge. The man who had seen her at her lowest and had not offered pity, but had offered sustenance. The journey to Silas Blackwood's ranch led her away from the main trail, into rolling, cedar-dotted hills where the silence was deeper, older. The ranch itself was not grand, but it was fiercely orderly. Fences stood straight and taut as harp strings, the barn was well maintained, and a small, solid house built of river stone sat beneath the shade of a lone cottonwood tree, a steady plume of smoke curling from its chimney. This was the home of a man who battled chaos with order, a place of solitude, not neglect. She found him in a large corral, working with a young, half-wild Mustang. He moved with a quiet, hypnotic grace, his hands firm but gentle, his voice a low, steady murmur that seemed to speak a language the horse understood better than any human. Fear and strength battled in the animal's powerful muscles, but under Silas's patient hand, the fear was slowly losing. He noticed her approach but didn't stop, continuing to stroke the horse's sweat-slicked neck until its trembling subsided and it stood still, its sides heaving. Only then did he turn to face her, his full attention a heavy, physical force. His eyes, now visible in the clear light, were a startling gray, the color of a stormy sky, and they held a deep, settled weariness, as if he had seen too much of the world and had decided to turn his back on it. "Came to return this," Ilara said, her voice tight with a pride she couldn't afford. She held out the woolen blanket he had left, which she had meticulously cleaned and folded. "I'm not looking for charity." Silas looked from the blanket to her face, a long moment passing in which the only sound was the wind in the cottonwood leaves. He wiped his calloused hands on his denim trousers. "Didn't figure you were," he said, his voice a low rumble. He nodded toward the porch of his house. "You know how to use a broom?" Elara blinked, taken aback by the sudden shift. "I do." "And a needle? And an axe?" "I can learn," she replied, her chin held high. He stared at her, his gaze unwavering, seeming to search for something deep within her. "I need a hand," he stated, the words stripped of all sentiment. "The place gets away from me sometimes. You cook, you clean, you mend my things, and you chop the firewood for this house. In return, you and your kin can use the old line shack down by the creek. It's dry and it's got a stove. I'll provide staples, flour, beans, salt. You hunt or grow the rest." He paused, his gray eyes locking onto hers. "It's not a gift. It's a wage." It was a bargain, as stark and unadorned as the landscape around them. It was a chance to trade her sweat for their survival. It was exactly what she needed. "Agreed," she said, without a single moment of hesitation. The line shack was small and smelled of dust and disuse, but as Silas had promised, it was dry. The roof was sound, and a small, pot-bellied iron stove stood in the corner like a silent, black guardian. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Elara felt a flicker of something akin to hope ignite in the cold emptiness of her chest. That evening, as she scrubbed Silas's kitchen floor, he sat at his table, meticulously cleaning his rifle, the pieces laid out on an oilcloth. The silence between them was immense, filled only by the rhythmic scrape of her brush and the sharp, metallic click of oiled steel. It wasn't an uncomfortable silence. It was a shared solitude, two people long accustomed to the quiet, working side by side. As the weeks bled into one another, a silent, unspoken rhythm was established between them. Elara rose before the sun, the familiar sounds of her lighting the fire in Silas's home becoming a part of his solitary mornings. She learned the heft of his axe, the way he liked his coffee black and strong, the specific cross-stitch he preferred for mending the inevitable tears in his work shirts. In return, he taught her things without ever seeming to teach. He showed her how to read the clouds for rain, how to find the brightest stars to guide her home in the dark, and one afternoon, she found a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird by the line shack door, a silent gift for Willow. He never spoke of his past, and he never, ever asked about hers. The unspoken rule was as clear and solid as the stone walls of his house. The past was a haunted country, and they were both refugees. Their fragile, hard-won peace was shattered on a Tuesday. Sheriff Brody rode out to the ranch, his face as grim as a thundercloud. "Silas," he said, dismounting heavily, his spurs chinking a nervous rhythm on the hard-packed earth. "Got a letter from a circuit magistrate down in Del Rio. Seems a man's been making inquiries. A man named Marcus Thorne." Elara, who was hanging laundry on a line nearby, froze, a wooden clothespin still pinched in her hand. The name was unfamiliar, but the sheriff's next words sent a bolt of pure ice through her veins. "He says he's the uncle to Jedediah Vance's children. Says he's been searching for him for months. He's coming to Dust River to claim his kin." Part 3. beneath the barren soil. Sevens. The name Marcus Thorne fell like an axe, shattering the fragile peace Elara and Silas had built. It hung in the air of the small stone house long after Sheriff Brody had tipped his hat and ridden away, a venomous promise of a storm far worse than any weather. For Elara, the word uncle was a cruel joke. Family had never been a source of comfort, only a cage of pain and neglect. The idea of a relative appearing now, after years of silence, felt not like a rescue, but like the approach of a vulture circling a fresh kill. A deep, primal fear, colder than any winter night, settled in her bones. She looked at Silas, searching his face for answers, but his expression was as unreadable as the gray, stormy sky of his eyes. He stood by the window, watching the dust settle on the trail where the sheriff had departed, his powerful frame a study in coiled stillness. He said nothing, but the set of his jaw was like granite, and his hand rested almost unconsciously on the worn stock of the rifle propped against the wall. The silence in the room was no longer the comfortable quiet of shared solitude. It was the tense, breathless hush before a lightning strike. The ghost of her past had returned, and this time it had a name and a legal claim. 2 days later, Marcus Thorne arrived in Dust River, not on a tired, trail-worn horse, but in a polished black buggy pulled by a handsome gray mare. He was the very picture of civilization, a stark contrast to the sun-bleached, wind-scoured town. Dressed in a dark wool suit and a crisp white shirt, he was clean-shaven, his smile warm, and his eyes full of a carefully practiced sorrow. He did not come brandishing weapons or shouting threats. His weapons were far more insidious: charm, sympathy, and the unassailable weight of the law. His first stop was the sheriff's office, where he presented a sheaf of papers that included what appeared to be a signed letter from Martha Vance, tearfully begging her estranged brother to find and care for her children. He told Sheriff Brody a masterful, heartbreaking tale of a family torn apart by Jedediah's demons, painting himself as the reluctant but dutiful savior. Next, he visited the church, making a generous donation and speaking with the preacher and his wife, Mrs. Gable, his voice resonating with grief for his poor, lost sister. He bought candy for the town's children at Henderson's store and spoke to all who would listen of his simple desire to give his orphaned kin a stable, God-fearing home. In less than a day, he had conquered Dust River without firing a single shot. The narrative was set. Elara was no longer a resilient survivor, but a misguided, perhaps even endangered, girl under the influence of a reclusive, potentially dangerous stranger. Silas Blackwood was no longer a silent benefactor, but a suspect, a man with a dark past who was keeping rightful children from their only family. The whispers followed Elara like a plague when she next came to town for supplies. The eyes that had once been merely suspicious were now openly hostile. Mrs. Gable saw her, turned her back with a righteous sniff, and guided her son away. The town had chosen its side. The inevitable confrontation came on a blistering afternoon. Marcus Thorne's black buggy rolled up the trail to Silas's ranch, with Sheriff Brody riding alongside, his face set in a mask of grim duty. Silas met them on the porch, his stance wide and immovable, Elara standing just behind him, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. Marcus stepped down from the buggy, his polished boots sinking into the dust, and smiled a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Miss Vance," he began, his voice as smooth as honey. "Elara, it is a relief to finally find you. I have been worried sick." He ignored Silas completely, his focus entirely on her. I understand you have been through a terrible ordeal, but your trials are over. I have come to take you and the children home. This is our home, Elara said, her voice trembling slightly but laced with steel. Marcus's smile faltered for a fraction of a second. My dear girl, this is a bachelor's ranch, a temporary shelter offered by a stranger. It is not a fit place to raise a family. I have a home, a fine house with room for all of you. You will be cared for. We care for ourselves, Silas's voice rumbled, low and dangerous. Marcus finally turned to him, his eyes narrowing. Mr. Blackwood, the sheriff has told me about your tragic history. A man who could not protect his own family is hardly a suitable guardian for another's. The words were a poisoned dart, aimed with precision. Elara saw Silas flinch, a barely perceptible tightening around his eyes, and a wave of protective fury washed over her. You know nothing about him, she said. And you, my dear, know nothing about me, Marcus countered smoothly. Which is why I have taken the proper, legal steps. Sheriff, if you would. Brody cleared his throat, avoiding everyone's gaze. Elara, Mr. Thorne has filed a formal petition for guardianship with the circuit court. The judge is due to arrive in Dust River in 2 months' time to hear the case. The words landed like a death sentence. 2 months. They were trapped, their fate to be decided by a stranger in a black robe. The weight of that deadline was a physical pressure, a constant, suffocating presence. The town was lost to them, the law was a weapon pointed at their heads, and Elara felt the walls closing in. The strain began to fray the edges of the trust she and Silas had so carefully built. He grew even more quiet, his watchfulness turning into a brooding intensity that she couldn't penetrate. He urged patience, a strategic retreat, telling her to lay low and give Marcus no ammunition. But to Elara, whose entire life had been a fight, patience felt like surrender. His caution felt like a lack of faith, a sign that perhaps he, too, believed their cause was lost. A terrible loneliness enveloped her, the feeling that even this one solid person in her life was beginning to drift away. In her darkest moment, gripped by a desperate need to find something, anything, that felt like her own, she made a decision. She had to go back to the source of all her pain. Under the cover of a moonless night, she returned to the abandoned Vance farmhouse. The place was even more derelict than she remembered, groaning in the wind like a dying animal. The air inside was stale with the ghosts of old arguments and spilled whiskey. With a flickering lantern, she went to the one thing her parents had left behind in their haste, a large, rotten leather trunk in the corner of the bedroom. It was filled with Martha's pathetic treasures, a faded wedding dress, a few chipped porcelain dolls, things that spoke of a life that had died long before they had driven away. Elara's hands sifted through the debris of her mother's failed dreams, a fresh wave of grief and anger washing over her. It was hopeless. There was nothing here for her. As she was about to close the lid, her fingers brushed against a loose thread in the worn fabric lining of the trunk. A strange lump. Driven by a final, inexplicable curiosity, she tore at the seam. The fabric ripped, revealing a small, oilskin pouch tucked away inside. With trembling fingers, she opened it. Inside was not money, not jewelry, but a single, folded piece of parchment, yellowed with age. It was a deed, but a strange one, written in a spidery hand she didn't recognize. Tucked inside, it was a hand-drawn map of their land. It looked like any other property map, except for one detail. A thin blue line snaked across the barren northern pasture, a place she knew to be nothing but rock and dust. Beside the line were a series of notes and measurements, and a name, carefully lettered, El Manantial Secreto, the secret spring, and beneath it, a longer note, Source never fails, even in drought. Grandfather's legacy. The paper felt like it had caught fire in her hands. It all clicked into place with a sickening, clarifying lurch. The land wasn't worthless. Marcus Thorne didn't want the children. He wanted their water. In a land where water was life, a secret, unfailing spring was a kingdom. He wasn't their savior. He was a thief, come to steal the only thing of value her family had ever truly possessed. Staring at the map under the ghostly lantern light, surrounded by the ruins of her past, Elara felt the fear that had been strangling her for weeks burn away, replaced by something new, something cold and sharp and dangerous. Resolve. The game had just changed. Part 4. Scars and Strategies. Sevens. Elara rode back to Silas's ranch as if pursued by demons, but for the first time, they were not the demons of her past, but the electrifying demons of purpose. She burst into the small stone house, the old map clutched in her hand like a holy relic, her face flushed from the cold night air and the fire of revelation. Silas was waiting, his posture rigid, a half-empty coffee cup sitting cold on the table beside him. He had been awake all night, a silent vigil she had not known he was keeping. Worry and a flicker of anger warred in his gray eyes as he saw her, but it all vanished when he saw the parchment she held. She didn't speak, merely smoothed the crinkled map onto the rough-hewn wooden table beneath the glow of the lantern. The silence stretched, thick and heavy, as he leaned over it. His calloused finger, scarred and sure, traced the familiar lines of the property, then stopped, hovering over the spidery script and the thin blue line that had changed everything. He looked up at her, his expression stripped of its usual guardedness, replaced by a slow, dawning comprehension. "My God," he breathed, the words a rough whisper. "All this time, it wasn't about you. It was about what's under your feet." In that moment, the dynamic between them shifted irrevocably. She was no longer a desperate girl he had taken in, a charity case, a reminder of a past he couldn't save. She was a woman with a legacy to defend, an ally with a weapon he had never imagined. He saw the iron in her spine, the strategic fire in her eyes, and for the first time, he saw a reflection of the same fierce, protective instinct that had driven him into solitude. That night, as a low wind moaned around the corners of the house, the walls Silas had built around his heart finally began to crumble. He stoked the fire, the flames casting flickering shadows across his rugged face, making the lines of pain etched there seem deeper than ever. "He called me a man who couldn't protect his own," Silas said, his voice low, addressed more to the fire than to her. He was right. Elara sat quietly, sensing that this was a threshold, a door to a place of immense pain he had never allowed anyone to enter. He began to speak, his words sparse and heavy, each one unearthed from a deep well of grief. He told her about Sarah, his wife, whose laughter, he said, was the only thing that ever made the wildflowers grow. He spoke of his son, a small boy named Daniel, with hair the color of corn silk. They had been his world, the center of his universe, the reason the ranch had ever felt like a home. He had been away in Fort Stockton, selling cattle, a trip that should have taken 3 days, but was delayed by a lame horse. When he returned, he saw the smoke from 10 miles out. A small band of Comancheros, drunk on stolen whiskey and casual cruelty, had swept through the valley. He had found his home a smoldering ruin, his world reduced to ash and silence. "I wasn't here," he said, his voice cracking on the final word, a single, devastating admission of the guilt that had been his only companion for 5 long years. "I wasn't here." Ilara did not offer empty words of comfort. She could not say, "It wasn't your fault." Instead, she reached across the small space between them and laid her hand on his, her touch a silent testament of shared understanding. She, too, knew the searing pain of abandonment, the agony of a world ripped apart. In the quiet language of survivors, in the space between their shared scars, they forged an alliance far stronger than any contract, a bond sealed not by words, but by the mutual recognition of a deep and terrible loss. Their grief gave way to strategy. They were no longer reacting, they were planning. The map was their key, but it was also a danger. To reveal it too early would give Marcus time to contest the deed or find a way to seize the land through legal trickery. Their first move was to win the only court that mattered in the short term, the court of public opinion. They needed to transform Ilara from a nameless stray into a vital member of the Dust River community. The opportunity came with a fury that only the Texas sky could unleash. A blue norther blew in without warning, a wall of ice and wind that plunged the world into a howling white chaos. The temperature dropped 40 degrees in an hour, and a blinding blizzard engulfed the plains. In the midst of the storm, a panic-stricken cry went up from the center of town. Mrs. Gable's young son, Timmy, who had been playing by the creek, was missing. The men of the town formed a search party, but it was hopeless. In the whiteout, they could barely see their hands in front of their faces. Ilara heard the news from Henderson, who had ridden out to warn them of the storm's intensity. A cold dread filled her, but it was followed by a spark of clarity. She remembered the creek, the caves and overhangs she had noted during her desperate foraging trips. She knew where a scared little boy might seek shelter. "I'm going," she said, pulling on a heavy coat. Silas stood in front of her, his face a mask of fierce opposition. "You will not. It's suicide out there. That little boy will die if someone doesn't find him," she shot back, her eyes blazing. "I know that area better than anyone. I'm going." Seeing the unshakable resolve in her face, the same resolve he had seen when she held the map, he knew he couldn't stop her. He simply nodded curtly. "Then we go together." Sevens. Their ride into the teeth of the blizzard was a nightmare of screaming wind and biting, needle-like snow. Silas led, his big horse pushing through the drifts, Ilara following close behind, the world a disorienting vortex of white. But her instincts were true. She led them to a small, eroded overhang, almost completely obscured by a snowdrift. And there, huddled inside, was Timmy, semi-conscious and blue with cold. They wrapped him in their blankets and raced back to town, a desperate, frozen journey against a dying clock. They burst into the preacher's house carrying the boy, a vision from the heart of the storm. The sight that greeted them was one Ilara would never forget. Mrs. Gable, her face a mess of frozen tears, saw her son, alive, and let out a cry that was half sob, half prayer. She rushed forward and took the boy, her hands brushing Ilara's. She looked up. Her icy disdain melted away, replaced by a raw, overwhelming gratitude that was almost painful to witness. "You," she whispered, her voice breaking. "You saved him." That single act, that selfless ride into the jaws of death, did what weeks of quiet dignity could not. It shattered the town's prejudice. The tide had turned. Marcus Thorne felt the shift in the wind. He saw the way the townspeople now nodded to Ilara, the way Henderson offered her credit at the store, the way Sheriff Brody's eyes now held a grudging respect when he looked at Silas. The story of the rescue had spread like a prairie fire, recasting Ilara as a hero and Marcus's narrative as a lie. He knew his careful campaign of charm and lawfare was failing. It was time for a new strategy. A few days later, as Silas was riding the fence line on the northern edge of his property, he found his path blocked. Marcus Thorne sat on his horse, no longer smiling. Flanking him were two hard-faced men with revolvers strapped low on their hips, their eyes as cold and empty as a snake's. The pretense of the concerned uncle was gone, stripped away to reveal the predator beneath. "Blackwood," Marcus said, his voice flat and devoid of its earlier warmth. "Your little play is over. The town might be full of sentimental fools, but I'm not. That girl, those kids, and that worthless patch of Vance land, they belong to me." He leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a low, menacing growl. "Drop the guardianship claim. Convince the girl to come with me. Or the next storm that hits this ranch won't be from Mother Nature." The threat hung in the cold, clean air, as sharp and ugly as a barbed wire fence. Silas said nothing, his hand resting near the butt of his own revolver, his gray eyes meeting the challenge with a cold, unwavering fire. The lines had been drawn. The war of whispers was over. A war of blood was about to begin. Part 5. Redemption in the Rain. Sevens. The day the circuit judge was due in Dust River dawned with an unnatural stillness. The sky was not a gentle blue, but a bruised, greenish-gray canvas, and the air was thick, heavy, and hot, holding its breath in anticipation of a violent release. On the Blackwood Ranch, a silent, methodical preparation was underway. Silas wasn't mending fences. He was cleaning his weapons, his movements precise and economical. He laid out his Winchester rifle, his Colt revolver, and a box of cartridges on the kitchen table, the polished steel gleaming ominously in the strange, sickly light. He was no longer the quiet recluse. He was a soldier preparing for a siege. Inside the stone house, Ilara worked with a similar, focused intensity. She wasn't baking bread. She was dragging heavy furniture to brace the doors, filling every bucket and pot with water, and gathering all the lanterns and oil into the main room. She instructed the children, her voice calm but firm, teaching them a new game called Silent as Stones, where they were to hide in the small, sturdy root cellar the moment she gave the word and not make a sound until she or Silas came for them. They were not just preparing for a legal battle. They were preparing for a war, a final, desperate stand against a man who they knew had been pushed past the limits of law and civility. The storm broke in the early afternoon, unleashing a biblical fury upon the plains. The sky ripped open, and rain fell not in drops, but in solid, wind-driven sheets that turned the world outside into a churning, gray chaos. The creek, their source of life, swelled into a raging, muddy torrent, swallowing its banks and turning the road to town into an impassable river. Thunder cracked overhead with the force of cannon fire, and flashes of lightning illuminated a landscape transformed into a primal, drowning world. They were utterly, completely alone. And in the heart of that chaos, they came. 4 riders, heads bowed against the deluge, their figures barely visible through the curtain of rain. It was Marcus Thorne and 3 hired guns, hard-faced men whose empty eyes spoke of cheap whiskey and casual violence. They used the storm as cover, the roar of the thunder masking the sound of their approach, their horses churning the trail into a sea of mud. They didn't ride up to the house. They dismounted by the cedar grove, tethering their horses and fanning out, their movements betraying a grim, predatory purpose. The polite charade was over. This was not a claim for guardianship. It was a violent abduction. The first shot was a deafening crack that seemed to split the world in 2, a sound distinct from the thunder. A window pane in the front room exploded inwards, spraying glass across the floor. "Now!" Elara screamed, her voice cutting through the din. The children, their faces pale with terror, scrambled into the root cellar without a whimper. Elara slammed the heavy door shut and dropped the thick iron bar into place just as Silas burst in from the porch, his rifle in hand. "The barn!" he yelled over the roar of the storm. "I can get a better angle. Keep the doors barred. Don't open them for anyone but me." He was gone in a flash, a gray shadow melting into the gray rain, leaving Elara alone in the besieged house. The battle began in earnest, a deadly game of hide-and-seek played out in the heart of a hurricane. From the hayloft of the barn, Silas became a ghost. His Winchester spoke in sharp, definitive bursts, pinning the attackers behind the corral fence. He used his intimate knowledge of every angle, every piece of cover on the ranch that had been his prison for 5 long years. But the hired guns were professionals. 2 of them laid down suppressing fire, forcing him to stay low, while the third, a wiry man with a knife scar on his cheek, made a mad dash for the house's blind spot on the western side. Inside, Elara was not just a frightened woman hiding from the violence. She was a strategist, a mother lion defending her den. Peeking through a crack in the boarded-up kitchen window, she saw the flanking maneuver. She couldn't shoot, but she could think. She grabbed the largest pot of water, which she had set to boil on the stove, and crept to the window the man was approaching. Just as he reached it, smashing the butt of his pistol against the glass, she let out a piercing scream from the front of the house, a perfect diversion. The man hesitated, turning toward the sound, and in that split second, Silas's rifle cracked from the barn. The man crumpled to the ground, a dark shape in the mud. One down. In Dust River, the storm was a prison, but the faint, intermittent sounds of gunfire, carried on the wind, were an undeniable alarm. Sheriff Brody, his face etched with a grim certainty, stood on the porch of his office, staring out at the impassable road. "He's doing it," he said to the small group of men huddled with him. "The damn fool is trying to take them by force." This was no longer a legal matter. It was an attack on members of their community. "I can't ask any of you to ride into this," the sheriff said, but he was already saddling his horse. A half-dozen men, including Henderson, the storekeeper, and the burly town blacksmith, did the same without a word. Their loyalty, so hard-won by Elara's courage, was now being forged into a weapon. They set out into the storm, a small, determined posse fighting their way through mud and flood, a desperate race against time. Back at the ranch, the fight intensified. Marcus, enraged by the loss of one of his men, ordered a full frontal assault. The remaining 2 gunmen charged the house, firing wildly. While Silas's rifle kept one pinned down, the other managed to kick open a back door that had been damaged by a falling branch. Ilara met him with the only weapon she had, the heavy iron poker from the fireplace, swung with all the force of her fear and fury. The blow caught the man on the shoulder, staggering him, but he lunged for her. In that moment of chaos, Marcus Thorne, seeing his chance, made a dash for the now unbarred front door. He burst in to see Ilara wrestling with the hired gun. He shoved the man aside and lunged for the cellar door. He was a man possessed, his face twisted into a mask of pure, desperate greed. He ripped the bar away and threw the door open just as Thomas, the oldest boy, was peeking out. Marcus grabbed him, yanking him out and holding him as a shield, a pistol pressed to the boy's head. "It's over! Blackwood!" he screamed, his voice cracking with madness. "Call off the fight, or the boy dies." The house fell into a sudden, terrifying silence, broken only by the storm and Thomas's terrified gasps. Silas appeared at the doorway, drenched and bleeding from a graze on his forehead, his rifle held at the ready. He froze, his eyes locking on the scene before him. It was a perfect, horrifying echo of his deepest nightmare. A helpless child, a ruthless attacker, and him, standing on the threshold. For a heart-stopping second, the ghosts of the past threatened to paralyze him. But then he looked past Marcus, past the gun, and met Ilara's eyes. He saw not fear, but a blazing, unwavering faith in him. He was not the man who had been absent 5 years ago. He was here. Now. With a speed that was almost inhuman, he dropped his rifle, his hand already moving to the Colt on his hip. He fired a single shot from the hip, not at Marcus, but at the lantern hanging from a beam just above his head. The lantern exploded, showering the room in burning oil and darkness. Marcus screamed, momentarily blinded, and loosened his grip on Thomas. It was all the opening Ilara needed. She launched herself forward, shoving Thomas to safety and bringing the iron poker down on Marcus's gun hand with a sickening crunch. The pistol clattered to the floor. Just as Marcus lunged for her, Silas was on him, his movements a blur of controlled fury. The fight was short, brutal, and decisive. As Silas slammed Marcus to the floor, the battered front door flew open, revealing Sheriff Brody and the mud-splattered faces of the townsmen, their guns drawn. As if on cue, the relentless pounding of the rain began to soften, and through a break in the churning clouds, a single, watery ray of sunlight pierced the gloom, illuminating the scene of victory. The storm was over. Part 6. Every Soul, a Name. Sevens. The dawn that followed the storm was born of an almost holy silence. The world, washed clean by the deluge, shimmered under a sky of impossible blue, the air crisp and smelling of wet earth and cedar. The Blackwood Ranch was scarred but standing, a testament to the resilience of its inhabitants. The reign of terror was over. By midday, 2 things arrived at the ranch. The first was a wagon from town, filled with neighbors led by a determined Mrs. Gable, carrying hot food, fresh bandages, and offers of help to mend the broken fences and windows. The second was the circuit judge, a stern, gray-bearded man named Hawthorne, who arrived to find the defendant, Marcus Thorne, bound and locked in the sheriff's jail, and the entire town of Dust River ready to serve as witnesses for the prosecution. The legal proceedings that followed were not a battle, but a formality. One by one, Sheriff Brody, Doc Elias, Henderson, and even a tearful Mrs. Gable stood before the judge and spoke. They didn't just speak of Marcus's crimes, they spoke of Ilara's courage, of Silas's quiet strength, and of the family they had forged not from blood, but from grit and decency. Judge Hawthorne, a man who had seen the worst of human nature across the frontier, listened intently. When it was done, he slammed his gavel down with a satisfying finality. Marcus Thorne and his surviving men were sentenced to a long term of hard labor for attempted kidnapping and assault. More importantly, the judge legally nullified any claim Marcus had, affirmed Ilara's sole ownership of the Vance property and its precious water rights, and formally granted her legal guardianship of her siblings. As she stood outside the makeshift courthouse, the legal papers clutched in her hand, Ilara felt the last of the ghosts of her past finally, truly, turn to dust and blow away on the Texas wind. In the weeks that followed, a new rhythm took hold, not just on the ranch, but in the entire community. The shared ordeal had transformed Dust River from a collection of suspicious individuals into a town with a heart. The work of rebuilding the ranch was a community effort, a joyful cacophony of hammers and saws where there had once been gunfire. But a question lingered for Ilara. One afternoon, she rode out to the old Vance farmhouse. The ruin stood silent, a monument to her pain. For a long time, she simply stared at it, the memories threatening to pull her under. But as she looked at the sturdy old beams and the solid foundation, she saw something else. She saw potential. She saw a place that could be reclaimed, reborn, just as she had been. That evening, she found Silas on the porch, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of rose and gold. "I don't want to run from that place anymore," she said quietly. "It took so much from me. I want to make it give something back." He turned to her, his gray eyes full of a deep, unwavering understanding. "What do you have in mind?" he asked. "A school," she said, the idea taking full flight as she spoke it aloud. "There are so many children in town with nothing to do but run wild. Children who feel like they don't belong anywhere. I want to build a place for them. A place where they can learn, where they can feel safe. A place where every soul has a name." Sevens. The idea, once spoken, took on a life of its own, embraced by the town with a fervor that astonished her. It was as if they had all been waiting for a chance to build something together. The blacksmith forged new hinges and a bell for the schoolhouse from melted down scrap. Henderson donated lumber and panes of glass. And Mrs. Gable, in her ultimate act of transformation, organized the women of the town into a committee, gathering books, sewing curtains, and pickling vegetables for the future students' lunches. The reconstruction of the old farmhouse became a symbol of the town's own rebirth. Men who had once looked at Ilara with suspicion now worked alongside Silas, raising a new roof over the place that had once sheltered only despair. As they worked, Henderson remarked, "This school is a real boon for this town, Miss." "A true blessing." The word stuck. It was perfect. A boon. A gift born from hardship. The place would be called the Boone School. One cool evening, as the project neared completion, Ilara and Silas stood on the newly built porch of the schoolhouse, the scent of fresh-cut pine filling the air. The sun was setting, and the valley below was bathed in a soft, golden light. They had worked side by side for months, their partnership as solid and unspoken as the landscape around them. Silas turned to her, his usual reticence giving way to a raw, simple honesty. He wasn't holding a ring, he was holding a freshly carved piece of cedar. "I was thinking about a sign for my ranch gate," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It feels too empty now. It's not just the Blackwood place anymore." He extended the piece of wood to her. Burned carefully into its surface were two words: Blackwood and Boone. He looked at her, his heart in his eyes. "My name is all I have left of a past I can't change. But my future is a blank page. I was hoping you'd help me write it, Ilara." It wasn't a flowery proposal, but it was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. "I will," she whispered, her own voice thick with emotion. "But my name, I cannot be Vance. And Blackwood is your story. I think I would like to be Ilara Boone. The name doesn't come from a father or a husband. It comes from all of this. From them." She gestured to the town, shimmering with lamplight in the distance. Silas smiled, a slow, genuine smile that transformed his weary face. "Ilara Boone," he said, testing the name. "It suits you. Our family, then, the Boones of Blackwood Ranch." Sevens. The first day of school was not a formal affair, but a town-wide celebration. The entire population of Dust River gathered on the grounds of the new Boone School, a place of light and laughter where a ruin had once stood. Blankets were spread on the grass for a community picnic, and the sound of children's excited voices filled the air. Thomas and Samuel, no longer haunted and silent, ran races with the other boys, their faces bright with joy. Willow, holding Silas's hand, pointed at the new school bell, her eyes wide with wonder. Ilara stood on the porch, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. She saw Sheriff Brody sharing a piece of pie with Doc Elias, both men smiling. She saw Mrs. Gable, a smudge of flour on her cheek, patiently showing a young girl how to read a primer. This was the family she had built, a sprawling, unlikely clan bound by shared struggle and a fierce, protective love. Silas came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers, his touch warm and solid. He was no longer a ghost haunting the edges of his own life. He was home. Ilara reached up and pulled the rope for the new bell. Its clear, bright tone rang out across the valley, not as a summons to lessons, but as a declaration of hope, a sound of victory over the silence. It was the sound of a new beginning, a promise that here, in this small, forgotten corner of the Texas plains, every soul would have a place, a purpose, and a name to call their own. The story of Ilara Boone began in the red dust of abandonment, a tale of a young woman left with nothing but her siblings and a name she refused to carry. Yet, it did not end there. We have journeyed alongside her from the absolute depths of despair, watching her forge an unlikely, unspoken alliance with Silas Blackwood, a man equally haunted by the ghosts of his own past. We stood with her as she faced down the calculated greed of a man who tried to steal her future by weaponizing her history, and we witnessed her evolution from a hunted survivor into a fierce protector of her newfound family. Her triumph was not simply in defeating a villain, but in rebuilding a world from its very foundations. This saga teaches us a profound and timeless truth of the frontier, and indeed, of the human heart. A name is not merely something you are given at birth, but something you must earn and define for yourself. Family is not always the blood you share, but the loyal hands you hold in the storm. Elara's journey is a powerful testament to the idea that our deepest scars do not have to be our endings. They can be the very ground upon which we build our greatest strengths. Here at Wild West Love Stories, we believe these are the tales that matter. We believe in the quiet ranchers with hearts as vast as the plains, and in the women with spirits as unbreakable as the mountains. If the story of Elara Boone resonated in your soul, if you believe in the power of second chances and the fierce, unyielding love of a family forged by choice, then become a permanent part of our community. Like this video if it moved you, share it with someone who needs a story of hope, and most importantly, subscribe to our channel so you never miss another tale from our campfire.